Good afternoon or evening. Hopefully you're enjoying watching videos. Just to fill you in, this is week 3, and we're supposed to be at the end of January 21. And I would note to you that that means we're completing Genesis 50, verse 26. I've got right now, if you would look at the screen there, I have the frontispiece of the Bible that we're using just for your remembrance. And I would note to you that there is January 21 in the Bible, in this particular Bible, and you will see that we are reaching Jacob's and Joseph's last days. So with that, I will offer some thoughts about our week's reading ending on January 21. I would remind you that Jacob had engaged in some, I don't know if we would call it chicanery or what, some not exactly up and up straight arrow dealings with his brother Esau, his fraternal twin brother Esau. And consequently, he and his mother decided it might be wise to exit stage right for Haran. So again, we see this replayed again. Not everybody, but the principal character migrates from Canaan back to Mesopotamia, to Haran, which is not exactly Mesopotamia, but it's very close. So he's back in Haran. And I would remind you that it was what is often called trickery that was performed with his brother. And now he's dealing with what I believe is his uncle, Laban, or Laban, as we often say. So he's escaped from Canaan to avoid Esau. He's now dealing with Laban, his wife's father, or soon-to-be wife's father, who, what a surprise, tricks him into marrying Leah first, and then he finally, a week later, I believe, he gets to marry Rachel. And the reality is, this is a highly dysfunctional family. I mean, there's almost nothing you can say about it that is strikingly upright and on the level. Nonetheless, it's somewhat encouraging to me that a person, Jacob, who engaged in this kind of monkey business was loved by God. So that means probably, if I'm not too vile, I have a fighting chance of being loved by God. And in fact, as we read, we'll find that we are indeed promised that we can be loved by God. So I would say that this whole familial situation can only be characterized as dysfunctional, as in our reading today it plays out ultimately by Jacob's favorite son, Joseph, being sold into slavery in Egypt. So how much more dysfunctional could a family become? I do not know, but this is very poor. This is a very poor familial arrangement. And if you read it carefully, there's plenty more to comment on it in that area. And again, note that much of the unloving of wives is because of the trickery that was involved with Jacob marrying Rachel. And I would note to you that when Jacob returned to Canaan, at that point, he wrestled with God, and this occurred at a place called Peniel, which means the face of God in Hebrew, according to our book, and I believe that. And at that point, Jacob becomes Israel. And that, according to our book, means struggles with God. And I think it's fair enough to say that we are all struggling with God. I think we are all trying to understand what God wants us to do. And sometimes we do it, sometimes we don't. Sometimes we don't have any clear idea what God wants us to do. And I'd say it's fairly clear that was true for Israel, for Jacob. Anyway, so Rachel, the loved wife of the four, finally has a son, and that son is Joseph. And that son is clearly the favored the favored child of the family. Now, I suspect there were many daughters as well. We know of one, I believe, Dinah. But the reality is that there probably were others. So we don't know. I don't think we know that with any certainty. But nonetheless, Joseph is a wonderful example for us to try to understand, to try to adopt the lifestyle that Joseph led. This guy is exemplary in every sense. So, as I said a moment ago, he did but he was sold into slavery by his brothers. But before that, and again, the somewhat dysfunctional family, I guess, he was sent seemingly just to help his brothers with tending sheep, and the result was that he brought back bad reports about what the brothers were doing, probably accurate, we don't know, or possibly not accurate. We really don't have a good way to unravel that. But what we do know is that this made him somewhat disliked by his brothers. And that's what ultimately led to the final problem in Canaan. But then, to top it off, he had dreams, which he was so happy to share with his family, including his brothers, in which even a rank amateur like myself in interpreting dreams, I have no skills in that whatsoever, but nonetheless, even I, if told the stories that Joseph told his father and brothers, I probably would have figured out, this dream seems to be asserting that we're all going to bow down to this young whippersnapper who seems to me to be just kind of a smart aleck. So I can see where there would have been some unpleasantness associated with that. So the long and short of it is that Jacob, once again, with his lovely coat that his father had made for him, is sent to check on the brothers. And I would say they've had a belly full of that. And so they decide, we'll kill him. That'll be the end of that. He won't do this again. Thankfully, one of the brothers, Reuben, who engaged in several other bad activities, but nonetheless, Reuben decided he would try to save the brother. So he says, no, we'll just put him in a pit. And he figured he'd come back and release him. But meanwhile, the other brothers sell him to a passing caravan headed for Egypt. So the long and short of that is that Joseph is now a slave sold to these traveling merchants heading to sell whatever from Mesopotamia into Egypt. So the second half of the journey begins. We go from Canaan back to Egypt. So that's how Joseph ends up in Egypt. And the reason I say that Joseph is such a good example is because in spite of having been clearly mistreated by his family, now obviously he was also made the favorite in the family, but within that family he was mistreated by being sold into slavery, but he chose to make the best of that situation throughout, working hard and trying to understand what God would have him do, which I think is the target for all of us. So myself, I'm deeply encouraged by this particular reading, and you will note that in the end, when Joseph finally reveals himself to the brothers, that here he is, the second or third most powerful person in Egypt, which was at that time undoubtedly the major kingdom of the entire earth, when he makes it clear to his brothers who he is, he says to them in plain language, I guess in Hebrew, that these things happened for good, that this was God's plan coming to fruition. So we can hope that we can find the same things in our own lives. And I mentioned earlier that Reuben engaged in some bad activities. You will discover in this reading that Reuben slept with his father's third or fourth wife. It's very confusing, but very evil. So we need to try to emulate Joseph's willingness to work with the challenges that God puts before us. And I would note to you that our next week's reading, which begins the start of the story of the founding, if you will, of the nation of Israel. And the reason I mention that is that there's a hiatus here in the reading. We're reading the Chronological Bible, and we've been reading it through from creation to Joseph's time in Egypt. And now there's basically a 350, approximately, year gap. There's no recorded information other than the fact that new pharaohs came into power who did not remember the good things that Joseph had done. So there you have it. We're going to be heading for the Exodus. That's our next stop. And I thank you all for participating in this. Hopefully we're being strengthened by our reading of the Chronological Bible. Thank you much.